A man carrying 2 grocery bags stopped beside the church parking lot, watched the blue tarp rise against the stone wall, and let out the kind of short, dismissive laugh people use when they think reality has already made the argument for them. A second joined in from the sidewalk, then a third. Within minutes, half a dozen eyes had settled on that strange little structure growing in the narrow strip of ground behind Saint Bartholomew's Parish Hall, where wind usually funneled through the alley like water through a chute. From a distance, it looked ridiculous, not like a proper tent, not even like one of the half-functioning homeless shelters people sometimes built from shopping carts, plywood, or whatever the city hadn't thrown away yet. This thing looked thinner than that, meaner, almost insulting in its simplicity. Before we go further, what do you think? Is this shelter smart, or a mistake waiting to happen? A church wall on one side, a slant of tarp on the other, a second loose layer hanging where no one thought it should hang, a pallet floor, flattened cardboard, 2 milk crates, a line of tied plastic bags, and a narrow opening so small most people thought it had to be a mistake. One of the men across the fence pointed at it and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That thing's gonna turn into a freezer." Another answered, "Not a freezer, a coffin." They laughed at that one. And the man building it, a gaunt figure in a brown coat with a frayed collar and a knit cap pulled low, did not answer. He tightened one corner line, tested the angle with his hand, then crouched to wedge a broken brick under the pallet to level it. Not hurried, not embarrassed, just exact. That was what people remembered later. Not the laughter, not the jokes, not even the way the tarp looked in the dirty winter light, flapping once, then settling flat. What they remembered was that he never argued. He never defended it. He behaved like a man adjusting something he already understood. At the time, though, no one read it that way. To them, he was just another rough sleeper trying to outsmart January with garbage. The weather report that afternoon gave the laughter its confidence. A cold front was dropping hard through the county, faster than expected, dragging wind behind it. By sunset, the temperature would be below 22 degrees. By midnight, it would slide toward the low teens. Gusts were forecast near 30 miles an hour, stronger in exposed corridors between buildings. Everyone in that neighborhood knew what those numbers meant, because cold in a city does not arrive evenly. It gathers in concrete, in wet fabric, in metal benches, in the seams of boots, in the cartilage of your hands. It finds the places already weakened, and if you slept outside, it found you fast. So when they looked at the tarp behind the church wall, they weren't just mocking the ugliness of it. They were mocking what they believed was obvious. Thin material, visible gaps, no stovepipe, no heater, no rigid frame, no shape that suggested safety. They saw blue plastic. He saw something else. His name was Daniel Mercer, though most people around the parish kitchen just called him Dan. 53 years old, narrow face, a beard that turned silver first at the chin, and the habit of lowering his eyes while he listened, as if he trusted words more when they arrived without performance. If you handed him coffee, he thanked you as though you had interrupted your life to do something serious. If you asked where he was from, he gave you the city name and nothing beyond it. If you asked how he ended up behind a church with a tarp and a cart full of scavenged material, he usually shrugged once and said, "Long road." It had been a long road. Years earlier, before the layoffs and the injury and the months when one unpaid bill opened the door for 5 more, Daniel had worked on renovation crews that most people never noticed. He was not the electrician, not the foreman, not the man whose truck carried the company name in clean lettering. He was one of the quiet specialists who came in after the louder work was done and made the buildings keep their promises. He wrapped pipe runs, sealed duct joints, cut rigid foam to fit ugly cavities, laid vapor barriers in crawl spaces that smelled like wet dirt and old wood. He spent winters inside half-finished schools, churches, clinics, and apartment buildings, measuring where heat disappeared. Not where people thought it disappeared, where it actually did. He knew what rising air did in a drafty corner. He knew what wet insulation became after a week. He knew the betrayal of concrete under a sleeping body, the lie of a space that looked enclosed but pumped heat out like a lung, the way 1 inch of trapped air could matter more than a thicker layer used badly. He had spent enough years in unfinished buildings to understand something most comfortable people never have to learn. Warmth is rarely about making heat first. It is about refusing to donate the heat you already have. That knowledge did not save his marriage. It did not repair his shoulder after a bad fall. It did not stop the slow collapse that can follow a man when work dries up and rent doesn't. But knowledge like that stays in the hands. It stays in the eyes. It changes what a person notices on a street, in a dumpster, near a loading dock. It lets one man see trash while another sees a floor, a windbreak, a radiant shield, a dry layer, a gasket. By the time he drifted into the parish orbit that winter, Daniel had already spent pieces of 2 cold seasons sleeping in ways that taught him what not to trust. He had tried ordinary tents. They failed for ordinary reasons. The ground pulled the heat out from below. Condensation gathered under the roof, froze, then shook down as ice when the fabric moved. Wind pushed through the seams, not enough to feel dramatic, just enough to keep the body working all night. He had tried thicker blankets in a shelter arrangement that looked safer than it was. That failed too, because insulation under compression loses value, and a man lying on cheap bedding over concrete is just cooperating with the cold. He had slept in doorways that blocked rain but amplified drafts. He had tucked himself behind dumpsters that hid him from sight and funneled air over the top, like a venturi tube. He had learned the miserable distinction between being covered and being protected. So when the temperature began to drop in earnest that year, Daniel started walking the blocks around Saint Bartholomew's with a surveyor's eye. The parish hall stood on the north side of the church lot, built in dark stone that absorbed pale afternoon sun and gave some of it back slowly after dusk. Behind it ran a service corridor, narrow and mostly ignored, where the wall faced south-southwest and interrupted the prevailing winter wind that came across the open street. There was just enough overhang from the gutter line to reduce direct drip if snow softened and refroze. The ground there was uneven but not sloped enough to pool water. More important, the wall itself offered something most people in that neighborhood never considered shelter to offer: mass. Not heat, not magic warmth bleeding from the church. Mass. A heavy wall does not keep a man alive by itself, but it changes the violence of temperature swings. It blocks wind, slows radiant loss on one side, and creates a zone where a smaller enclosed space can work better than it would in the open. Daniel studied that wall the way a carpenter studies a joist before trusting it. Then he began to gather pieces. A shipping pallet from behind a flooring store. 3 sheets of corrugated cardboard from an appliance outlet. A section of silver-faced bubble wrap insulation someone had thrown out after a delivery. 2 wool blankets from the donation room. A torn but serviceable painter's tarp. 1 blue polyethylene tarp with intact grommets. Half a roll of tape. Binder clips. Twine. A foam gym mat missing one corner. An old shower curtain. A dented aluminum windshield reflector from a junked sedan. 2 5-liter water jugs with screw tops. A cheap analog thermometer and a digital probe thermometer someone at the soup line said didn't work anymore. Daniel tested it against the kitchen cooler. It worked well enough. People noticed him collecting all this and assumed, naturally, that he was assembling clutter. That was part of why the ridicule came so easily when the build began. He set the pallet first, not directly on the dirt, but on brick fragments and short lengths of wood so air could move underneath without the wood wicking moisture from the soil. Then he leveled it. Then he laid cardboard flat, then more cardboard crosswise, then the foam mat where his torso would rest, because core heat mattered more than insulating the whole footprint evenly. The milk crates were not furniture. They were part of the frame, positioned to create a low ridge line at one end without making the interior volume too large. He stretched the inner layer first, not the blue tarp, but the painter's tarp, clipped and tied to form a low sleeping cell barely high enough to roll inside. Over that he draped the reflective material, not flush against his body area, but offset where it could help bounce radiant heat without trapping too much moisture in the wrong place. Then came the shower curtain in a narrow strip where condensed vapor might otherwise drip onto bedding. Finally, the blue tarp went outside as weather skin, leaving a deliberate air gap between the outer and inner layers. What passersby saw was a badly pitched tarp. What Daniel built was a system. The opening was small on purpose, canted away from the main wind and shaped like a low, offset mouth rather than a wide flap. Inside, the sleeping chamber was shorter than the shelter's visible footprint because he used a kind of improvised vestibule created by the gap between outer shell and inner cell. Cold air could gather there first. Wet boots stayed there. Snow on clothing could shake off there. Heat from his body did not have to warm a useless volume. One line of the blue tarp was weighted down close to the ground with bricks in reusable grocery bags, not simply to hold it in place, but to stop wind from pumping under the edge. Another edge remained vented just enough to let moisture escape. He used cardboard not as primary insulation alone, but as sacrificial dry layers and shape control. He used the wall as the most expensive component in the entire design, though he didn't own it and never touched it with anything permanent. It cost almost nothing because he understood exactly what to spend. That, too, made people laugh. One of the church volunteers, a heavy-set man named Richard who prided himself on practical common sense, came around the corner while Daniel was tying the last line and stopped dead in the service corridor. "You can't mean to sleep in that." Daniel sat back on his heels and nodded once. Richard stared at the tarp, then at the little entrance, then at the pieces of cardboard stacked under one end. "That is thinner than a tent." "It's smaller than a tent," Daniel said. Richard frowned. "That isn't better." "For heating it is." "With what heat?" Daniel looked at him a second, then tapped his own chest with 2 fingers. "Mine." Richard snorted the way men do when they hear something technically possible and socially absurd. "Your heat is not beating tonight." Daniel didn't take offense. He just asked if the kitchen had any spare jugs that could hold hot water without leaking. That story moved fast. By evening, the shelter had already acquired a reputation. People coming for the parish meal stopped to look. Some pretended concern. Some were sincere. Some were amused in the casual, hard-edged way that public hardship invites. 2 teenagers from the apartment block across the alley stood on a low retaining wall and grated it like a joke. One woman said she had seen better shelter under a picnic table. Another said the church should make him come inside because the whole thing looked one gust away from the trash heap. Daniel heard all of it. He kept adjusting. There are different kinds of ridicule. Some are cruel. Some are nervous. Some is the noise people make when they are trying to reassure themselves that they know how the world works. This was a blend of all 3. Most of them were not evil. Most of them were simply certain. Cold, in their minds, was a contest won by thickness, by money, by visible solidity, by machines that produced heat. If a shelter did not look like a shelter, if it did not advertise security, if it did not resemble the commercial products they recognized, then it had to be a failure dressed in desperation. They had no category for a structure that looked flimsy but had been tuned like a trap. Daniel did. The first person to notice that there might be more going on was a woman named Lorraine, who helped with the evening meal and had known enough hard years to distrust first impressions. She found Daniel by the side door filling one of the water jugs from an urn and watched him slide the hot container into an old wool sock before capping it. "Are you planning to sleep with that?" she asked. "For a couple hours," he said. She nodded. "And the rest?" He lifted the second jug. "This one goes by my feet." Lorraine looked out toward the service corridor. "That little tarp thing." Daniel smiled, but only with one corner of his mouth. "Little is good. Everybody says it's foolish. Everybody sees the tarp." She waited, and after a moment he added, "Ground matters more. Wind matters more. What matters more? If I stop those, I don't need to make summer. I just need to stay on the right side of trouble." That was Daniel's way. No speech. No effort to impress. Just the kind of sentence a person makes after years of losing arguments with reality until only the useful words remain. Before full dark, he climbed inside to test the space. Lorraine, standing near the entrance, could hear almost nothing once he tucked the flap down. Then his hand emerged and held out the digital thermometer probe wire, asking her to pass it back in through a gap near the head end. He wanted one reading inside the sleeping cell and one outside under the overhang, sheltered from direct wind. She asked why. "So I know what changed," he said. She laughed softly. "Are you logging data now?" "I'd rather know than guess." That answer stayed with her. By 9 o'clock, the air outside had already sharpened into something metallic. Cars moved through the street with a high, dry hiss under their tires. Breath turned instantly white. The church lot emptied early. Those who had someplace to go went there. Those who didn't move toward whatever arrangements they trusted most, even if trust meant habit more than wisdom. Several men chose the steam tunnel grate 3 blocks away. Another dragged his tent closer to a fenced loading dock. Richard came out once more, hands in his coat pockets, and stood over the tarp with the expression of a man waiting for bad news to confirm itself. "You can still come inside the warming room," he called. A pause. Then Daniel's voice, muffled but calm. "I know." Don't be stubborn. Another pause. Not stubborn. What then? Testing it. Richard stared at the tarp for a few seconds and shook his head. You are either a genius or a fool. From inside came the driest possible reply. Tonight will tell us. That first night was not yet the cold front everyone feared. It was only the edge of it, a hard preview. Enough to punish mistakes, not enough to make headlines. By dawn, the outside thermometer showed 19 degrees. The probe inside the sleeping cell had spent much of the night between 37 and 43, depending on when Daniel was awake, when the hot water had faded, when the wind shifted. Those numbers did not describe comfort the way a heated room does. They described a survivable microclimate where dry insulation, blocked wind, elevated flooring, and retained body heat kept the system working. More important, Daniel emerged dry. Not cozy, not triumphant. Dry. His beard held a little frost near the mouth. The outer tarp glittered white. But when Lorraine bent down later and touched the inner layer, she found only a trace of damp near the vent line. Not the soaked, miserable interior most tents grew in freezing weather. The wool blankets inside were cool, but not wet. The cardboard under the foam had stayed intact. The jugs, empty now of heat, had done their brief work and then become nothing more than shaped objects at his feet. Richard looked at the thermometer readings Daniel had copied into a small notebook and grunted. It worked one night. Daniel nodded. One night. You know tonight's the real one. I know. That should have ended the laughter, but partial proof rarely defeats certainty. In fact, it can make people more dismissive. They tell themselves the first success was luck. Conditions were milder than expected. The man slept badly and only looked fine. The shelter was living on borrowed time. The same men who had mocked it the day before now upgraded their verdict from immediate stupidity to temporary stupidity. It would still fail. The cold front was still coming. And they were right about one part of that. The real test was still coming. It arrived the next afternoon under a sky the color of old steel. Wind moved through the bare trees with a sound like coarse paper being crumpled far overhead. The temperature dropped all day instead of holding. A delivery driver at the corner store said he'd heard the open country west of town was already in single digits. The local forecast updated again. Overnight low of 11, perhaps lower with exposure, gusts 30 to 35. Dangerous for anyone without proper shelter. Dangerous even for some who had it. By 4 in the afternoon, the church staff began urging everyone they could reach to take indoor space wherever possible. Cots filled. Chairs filled. A few people refused because crowding and noise made sleep impossible. A few had reasons they didn't explain. Daniel said little. He spent the last light of day improving the tarp setup in ways that again looked foolish if you didn't understand the aim. He narrowed the entrance further with an extra fold and clipped it so the opening sat lower than the sleeping platform. He added one more cardboard layer under the hip zone, where compression had been highest the night before. He brushed snowless dirt away from the edges so his weighted skirt could sit tighter to the ground. He ran a second cord to change the angle of the outer tarp, shedding wind better from the northwest. He placed the hot water jugs earlier this time, one near the foot, one near the abdomen, each wrapped in cloth to avoid sweat-inducing direct heat. He hung the windshield reflector along the wall side, near shoulder height, not to create fantasy warmth, but to reduce radiant loss toward the colder surface during the first hours after dark. He loosened the vent line once, then retied it after checking the airflow with a match held outside, away from the shelter. Every motion said the same thing. He had done this kind of thinking before. Around sunset, a small audience formed without meaning to. A mother waiting for her son after choir practice. Richard from the kitchen. 2 men from the alley. The teenagers again, quieter now, but still skeptical. Lorraine carried a tray back to the side door. No one announced themselves as spectators. They were simply drawn to the tension of an experiment everyone believed they already understood. One of the alley men spoke first. If you make it till morning, I'll say I was wrong. Daniel kept tying a line. All right. The man smirked. You won't. Daniel tested the knot, then looked up. His face held no challenge, no theatrical courage, just fatigue and a strange steadiness. Maybe not, he said. It is hard to mock someone who leaves room for reality. The wind picked up after dark. By 9 the tarp was snapping in short, violent bursts, then going tight again. Fine powder from old snow along the lot edge lifted and drifted in silver streamers through the streetlights. The stone wall behind the shelter darkened with gathered frost. Traffic thinned. The city seemed to retreat into itself, windows lighting up and ceilings shut one by one. Behind Saint Bartholomew's, the service corridor turned into a narrow channel of moving cold. If the setup was going to fail, this was the kind of night that would make it fail publicly. Richard checked once at 10. Daniel answered from inside. Voice clear. Said he was fine. Lorraine came by at midnight with extra hot water in a thermos and found the entrance still properly aligned. No drift piling in, no obvious signs of collapse. Daniel opened the flap only enough to take the refilled jug. The air that slipped out felt cool, but not icy. She noticed that before she noticed anything else. Are you awake? She asked. For now. How is it? Outer space is cold, he said. Inner space is doing its job. It was a dry little sentence, almost a joke, but it landed because his tone never changed. Lorraine asked for the thermometer reading. Outside 12, he said. Vestibule 22. Head and 36. And inside your bedding? Warmer. How much warmer? A pause. Then, enough. She smiled in the dark. You and your secrets. Not a secret, he said. Just not the same measurement. That mattered. People think of warmth as one number. A room number. A thermostat number. Daniel knew better. Air temperature matters, but so do the surfaces around you, the speed of air movement, the dryness of the insulation, the protection under your body, the trapped heat inside bedding. In severe cold, a shelter that keeps the air in the 30s can still preserve a sleeping core far higher than that if the system prevents convective stripping and ground conduction. He was not trying to create a cabin. He was trying to reduce the cold's avenues of theft. At 2:17 in the morning, according to the notebook he showed later, the outside probe hit 10 degrees. Gusts were strong enough to shake loose grit from the gutter line. The vestibule held at 21. The head-end probe inside the sleeping cell read 35. Tucked deeper within the bedding envelope, near the chest after he had lain still for some time. The thermometer briefly reached 48. Those were not luxurious numbers. They were winning numbers. A man in a cheap tent would not have described that difference as small. Somewhere after 3 the wind shifted and began pressing harder across the lot. One of the teenagers, restless and unable to sleep in the apartment across the alley, looked out his window and later said he expected to see the tarp flattened by morning. It looked too light to survive the gusts. Too low. Too improvised. Too poor. But low was the point. There was no broad face for the wind to own. No wasted height. No decorative volume. The lines were short, the load was close to the ground, and the wall behind the shelter took the brute force out of one entire direction. Ugly engineering often survives because it has surrendered vanity. Just before dawn, while the city was at its coldest and quietest, a small incident sealed the story. Another man sleeping rough nearby had tried the loading dock and failed. The place blocked overhead exposure but turned into a tunnel when the wind shifted. Shaking, angry, and unable to get warm, he made his way toward the church side lot hoping someone might open up the warming room early. On the way, he passed the tarp behind the wall and, by his own telling, thought he had found a burial mound of blue plastic. Then he heard Daniel cough inside. He banged lightly on the outer line and said, "You alive in there?" A moment later the flap opened an inch. "Yeah." The man stood in the dark with ice on his eyebrows and said the thing no one had expected to say to Daniel Mercer's ridiculous tarp shelter. "How warm is it?" Daniel looked at him for a second, then shifted the flap wider and let him put a hand into the vestibule space. Not the sleeping cell, just the buffer chamber between layers. The man jerked his hand back and stared. It wasn't warm in the ordinary sense. It was simply not savage. Out there, the air cut like filed steel. Here, for one impossible instant, it did not. Later he would tell people, it felt like stepping near a doorway that belonged to another season. By 6:30, the east edge of the sky was beginning to gray. Frost made the tarp look armored. The city resumed itself in sounds first: garbage truck brakes, distant bus compression, tires on salted streets. Parish staff began arriving. One by one, the people who had laughed came back into the orbit of that narrow service corridor, some openly curious now, some pretending they had business near the bins or side entrance. Richard was there. Lorraine too. The 2 alley men. The mother from choir practice. One of the teenagers with his hands shoved in his hoodie pocket, trying to look unimpressed. A maintenance worker carrying keys. Even a patrol officer who had seen the setup the day before slowed his step. The flap moved. For a moment no one spoke. Daniel emerged carefully, not with the stiff panic of a man who had survived by accident, but with the measured movements of someone rising from cramped, disciplined sleep. He pushed the blanket bundle aside, sat on the pallet edge, and held still while the cold met him. Vapor drifted from his mouth in slow white bursts. He looked tired. Of course he looked tired. But his eyes were clear. His hands, when he flexed them, responded normally. He was not shivering. He reached back inside and pulled out the notebook. No speech. No grin. No demand to be admired. Just the notebook. Richard stepped forward first. How bad did it get? Daniel showed him the page. Times, temperatures, brief notes in blocky handwriting. 10 degrees outside at the worst reading. Wind strong. Vestibule 21. Head and 35. Bedding core higher. Minimal frost inside. No wet through. Slept in intervals. Reheated foot jug once around midnight. Adjusted vent line at 105. Richard read it twice. The alley man who had promised to admit he was wrong leaned over his shoulder, then straightened slowly and looked at the tarp as though it had changed species overnight. The teenager asked the question everyone else was thinking but was too proud to phrase plainly. How? Daniel turned and tapped 3 places with his gloved hand. The ground, the air gap, the low opening. Off the ground. Stop the wind. Keep the heat where the body can use it. Richard frowned at the numbers again. That's it. Daniel shrugged once. And stay dry. Lorraine, standing a little apart, noticed something then that never left her. The people who had laughed were not speaking the way they had the day before. Their faces had lost that easy confidence. Not because they had witnessed a miracle. Daniel had not defeated winter with a tarp. He had not turned the alley into a heated room. What had happened was more unsettling than a miracle. Something they had looked down on had proved them shallow. An ugly little shelter made from cast-offs had survived a night they were sure would expose it. A man they had read as desperate and foolish had been calmly running an experiment. The difference between ridicule and respect, in that moment, was only a few thermometer readings and 1 dry blanket. But it was enough. Silence spread through that narrow corridor in a way laughter never had. Daniel began dismantling part of the outer edge to shake off frost. Richard stopped him. Wait. Daniel looked up. Show me. It was not a dramatic plea. Just 3 words. But they carried the weight of surrender. So Daniel showed him. He lifted the outer tarp and explained why the gap mattered. He pressed a hand to the cardboard layers and talked about compression. He showed the vent placement and why a fully sealed shelter becomes wet and dangerous. He demonstrated how the low opening kept the main warm pocket from spilling upward and out every time he moved. He explained that heat sources are expensive, visible, and often risky, while heat retention can be built from almost nothing if you understand the path loss takes. He said a stone wall is not a furnace, but it is not nothing either. He pointed to the pallet and said, concrete or frozen ground will take you faster than air does. He lifted the wool and said, dry is part of warm. He touched the hot water jug and said, this buys a few hours. The rest has to be built. The people listening were not hearing survival advice from a podium. They were receiving a correction from a man they had already dismissed. And that is a difficult thing to receive with grace. Some managed it better than others. The alley man actually did say, I was wrong. One of the teenagers asked if the inner layer had to be canvas or if another fabric would work. The patrol officer nodded once and said he wished more people knew the ground piece. Lorraine fetched coffee without being asked. Richard, who had spent 2 days trying to talk Daniel out of the shelter, crouched beside the pallet like an apprentice and asked how much the whole thing would cost if a person had to buy every part secondhand. Daniel considered it. Maybe $30, he said. Maybe less if you find the right scraps. Richard looked at him for a long second. 30. Daniel nodded. Outside was still barely above 10. Inside that ugly little system, he had stayed on the right side of trouble. That contrast moved through the parish faster than any sermon. By afternoon, people were no longer calling it stupid. They were calling it clever, then smart. Then, once enough embarrassment had settled in, they stopped attaching adjectives altogether and just described what it was. Daniel's setup. The tarp wall shelter. The thing behind Saint Bartholomew's. Language softened first. Judgment trailed behind. Over the next few days, 2 others asked for help improving their own cold weather arrangements. Daniel showed one man how to raise his sleeping platform off concrete, using scavenged slats and folded cardboard. He helped another reorient a cheap tent so the entrance wouldn't drink wind all night. He explained why large interior volume punishes the poor, why wet socks inside a sealed space become a moisture tax by morning, why a reflective layer pressed directly into damp fabric is not the same as a radiant barrier with air beside it. None of it sounded glamorous. All of it sounded earned. He never became chatty. He never turned into a local legend in the boastful sense. But something in the social order had shifted. People made room for him differently. They asked before assuming. They listened all the way through an answer. That is not a celebrity. It is rarer. It is an earned regard. And it began because they laughed too soon. That is often how these reversals happen. Not with villains and heroes in the easy shapes people prefer, but with ordinary human arrogance meeting ordinary human competence under pressure. Something looks wrong because it violates the visual language of success. It looks poor, improvised, temporary, unsophisticated. So the verdict arrives before the evidence. The eye passes sentences. Later reality walks in carrying numbers. If you had seen Daniel's shelter for the first time in daylight, without context, you might have done the same. You might have looked at the blue tarp and the cardboard and the wool rolled tight under cheap cord and thought, there is no way that can work. Most people did. Maybe you would have too. But winter has very little respect for appearances. Winter respects only transfers. Air movement, moisture, conduction, volume, exposure, surface, time. Daniel knew that because life had taken enough from him to leave him with the truths that remain when comfort goes away. He was not better than the people who laughed. He was simply more intimate with consequences. He had spent longer where bad design became pain before dawn. He had paid attention where others had the luxury not to. And if there is an uncomfortable question hidden inside this story, it is not only whether a tarp can outperform a judgment. It is how quickly we decide what intelligence is supposed to look like. How often do we call something foolish because we do not recognize the shape of the thinking inside it? How often do we mistake polish for competence and roughness for failure? Those are not winter questions alone. A week later the cold eased. Snow came, then a thaw, then another freeze. The shelter changed slightly over time. Daniel replaced a frayed line, added a cleaner ground sheet, and shifted the vent when the weather turned damp. He was not sentimental about the design. If a method failed, he altered it. If a piece absorbed too much moisture, he discarded it. Survival has no room for ego. That was part of the lesson too. Eventually the parish arranged something steadier for him. Not immediately. Real life does not turn on one dramatic dawn. But doors opened differently after people began to see him as a man with knowledge rather than a problem with a beard. Richard found him odd jobs in maintenance. Lorraine introduced him to a contact at a housing office who took him seriously because the church staff did. Respect does not solve poverty, but contempt makes every problem harder. The morning after the cold front, contempt lost ground. Years later, what remained in people's memory was not the temperature reading, though some still remembered that outside had hit 10 and the vestibule had held above 20. It was not the exact cost, though Richard liked to tell anyone who would listen that the whole setup worked for less than many people spend on takeout in a week. It was not even the technical trick of the double layer or the pallet floor. It was the quiet that followed the laughter. That service corridor behind Saint Bartholomew's had heard plenty of things over the years. Delivery noise, arguments, winter wind, the ordinary machinery of a city trying to ignore its own margins. But on that morning, when Daniel Mercer crawled out of a shelter people had mocked and stood there breathing steadily into the bitter air, the place went still in a different way. Not dramatic stillness, human stillness. The stillness that arrives when a group of people realizes they were measuring a man by the wrong instrument. The teenager across the alley would later say he never forgot Daniel tapping the ground, the air gap, and the opening. Richard remembered the notebook. Lorraine remembered the sentence about staying on the right side of trouble. The alley man remembered putting his hand into that vestibule space before dawn and feeling, against all expectation, that cold had been negotiated with instead of merely endured. And Daniel himself, if you had asked him to sum it up, probably would not have said anything grand at all. He might have looked at the wall, the tarp, the little ledger of numbers in his pocket, and said what he had known from the start. People saw plastic. He saw a system. That was the difference between ridicule and shelter, between looking poor and thinking clearly, between a night Everyone expected to break him, and a morning that changed the way they looked at his face. By then the laughter was gone. In its place stood a few changed men, a woman holding coffee that had gone half cold in her hands, a teenager no longer smirking, and a narrow strip of winter ground beside a church wall where no one had much to say. Sometimes respect does not arrive as applause. Sometimes it arrives as silence. If this changed the way you see things, subscribe to Frontier Trapper.